On the first morning of 1862, a young man from Rhode Island named Elisha Hunt Rhodes sat in a cold tent somewhere in Northern Virginia and opened a small diary he carried with him wherever the army went. He had been a soldier for 7 months by then, long enough to have marched through summer heat and autumn rain, long enough to have stood in a battle line and heard and seen things for which his earlier life had left him entirely unprepared. Outside the tent, the camps of the Union Army of the Potomac spread across the frozen ground for what seemed like miles in every direction, a temporary city of canvas and wood smoke and chimneys improvised from empty cracker boxes, home to more men than any city in Rhode Island had ever held. He was 19 years old. He wrote in his diary that day that he had never, in all his life, been happier. It is worth sitting with that sentence for a moment, turning it slowly, the way you might turn something small and unexpected in your hand. Because in order to understand what the Civil War was actually like for the men who fought it, you have to start where they started, not in the smoke of the great battles, not in the field hospitals or the prison camps or the long grief that followed. You have to start in the summer of 1861, in the weeks before any of that, when the whole enormous thing still looked, from the inside, like something a man could hold in his mind without flinching. Picture the spring of that year. The country had been fracturing for a long time, the arguments about slavery and territory and the nature of the Union itself growing louder and more desperate with every passing season, the kind of slow institutional cracking that most people feel before they can name it. The way a house can seem wrong before anyone finds a split in the foundation. Then, on the 12th of April, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, and within 2 days the garrison had surrendered, and the crack had become something you could not talk yourself past. The United States was at war with itself. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers 3 days after the fort fell. He asked them to serve 90 days, which tells you something important about how anyone in Washington imagined the war at its beginning. A brief crisis, a sharp correction, something to be resolved before the summer got too hot. The men who answered that first call believed it. They had very little reason not to. Most of them had never seen a battle. The war existed for them in newspapers and speeches and the bright patriotic imagery that filled both. And from that distance, it looked like an adventure with a comprehensible and not especially distant end. They came from everywhere in the North. They came from the small farms of Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, where a man could spend an entire life within a count of the place he was born, and where the news from Charleston arrived by telegraph and then by word of mouth, rippling outward through general stores and churchyards until it reached men standing in fields with nothing over their heads but open sky. They came from the mill towns of Massachusetts and the tanneries of Pennsylvania, from counting houses in Boston and machine shops in Pittsburgh and the sprawling waterfront docks in New York City, where ships from every nation in the world were loading and unloading, and the noise never fully stopped. They came from the crowded Irish neighborhoods of every northern city, where families who crossed an ocean to escape starvation found themselves in a country already tearing itself apart, and who chose, in large numbers, to fight for that country anyway. They came from a German settlement of the Ohio Valley in the upper Midwest, where men who had fled the failed revolutions of 1848 heard in this new conflict something that rhymed with fights their fathers had already had about liberty, about the meaning of a republic, about whether fine words in the Constitution were meant to be kept. They were farmers and blacksmiths and school teachers and apprentice carpenters and men who worked in mills and men who worked on rivers and young men who had been doing nothing in particular and were looking, perhaps without fully knowing it, for a reason to become someone. The youngest were 15 or 16 years old, lying carefully about their ages to the recruiting officers, some of whom were willing to be deceived because their assignment was to fill the roles and not to ask questions that would empty them. The oldest were men in their 40s and 50s who remembered the Mexican War and told the younger men around them that they understood what they were getting into, and who were, in at least some respects, as unprepared as anyone. Elisha Rhodes had been working as a clerk in Providence when the news of Fort Sumter came through. He was 19, slight and dark-haired, the kind of young man who paid close attention to everything around him and kept most of his observations to himself unless someone thought to ask. His father had died when Elisha was a boy, which meant he knew something about carrying weight without drawing attention to it. When the call came, he did not deliberate for very long. He enlisted in the 2nd Rhode Island Volunteer Infantry in the early summer of 1861, and on one of his first days as a soldier, he opened a small journal and began to write in it. And he did not stop for 4 years. The early entries have a quality that is almost difficult to describe, a luminous attentiveness, the prose of someone who understands, even at 19, that this is a central experience of his life, and is paying the kind of attention you pay to something you mean to remember precisely. He notices weather and landscape, and the specific qualities of the men around him. He is earnest without being naive, thoughtful without being ponderous. He is not unusual in this. The letters and diaries that survive from the early months of the war carry that same quality. Men watching themselves closely, writing home with particular care, understand that they have stepped or been stepped out of ordinary time. The act of enlisting in the summer of 1861 was rarely private or quiet. Towns across the North organized their recruiting with festive urgency. Trestle tables in courthouse squares, flags hung across main streets, recruiting officers on improvised platforms giving speeches that drew on every register available to them. Patriotism, duty, the memory of the Revolution, the idea of the Union as a thing worth bleeding for. Local politicians spoke. Ministers invoked Providence. Newspapers printed the names of companies as they formed. And young men who had not yet signed up read those lists in barbershops and at post office counters and in the pews of Sunday churches, and felt things they could not entirely account for. There was social pressure in the air, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. To enlist was to be a patriot, and to wait was to invite a question that nobody asked out loud, but that hung in the air regardless. Women sometimes presented white feathers, the old symbol of cowardice, to young men who had not yet gone, though this was probably less systematic in America than it later became in Britain during the next Great War. Still, the atmosphere was charged and expectant. If you were young and able-bodied and you lived in a northern city or town in the summer of 1861, the question followed you from conversation to conversation. And yet to reduce the enlistment to social pressure alone would be just as dishonest, because for a great many of these men the idealism was genuine and the decision was real. They believed in the Union. They believed, many of them, that slavery was a thing the country needed to be rid of, or they came to believe it. And the war gave that belief a direction, particularly among the soldiers who enlisted in the United States colored troops, who came later in larger numbers after the Emancipation Proclamation formally transformed what the war was being fought for. The stakes were not abstract at all. These were men fighting for the freedom of their families, for the freedom of 4 million people held in bondage, for the radical proposition that the country might actually become what it had claimed to be since its founding. They enlisted knowing that Confederate forces had declared they would not treat black prisoners as prisoners of war, knowing, that is, that capture might mean death or re-enslavement. They enlisted in large numbers anyway, with a clarity of purpose that made the white soldiers who served beside them take notice, even when they did not quite know how to say what they noticed. But in the summer of 1861, all of that still lay ahead. Right now, there's a warm morning in a New England city, and a line of young men waiting to sign their names and take their oath. The medical examination they underwent before being accepted was, in the war's early months, often perfunctory in ways that would have consequences later. A doctor examined their teeth. Teeth mattered, because loading a rifle musket required a soldier to tear open powder cartridges with his mouth. He looked at their hands and feet, checked for hernias, asked about a history of fevers or fits, peered at their eyes. Many men who were underage passed through without difficulty. Men in poor health, men who were hard of hearing, men with conditions that would have disqualified them in a better organized system. All of them were passed along in a rush to fill the roles before summer ended, and the war, which everyone assumed would be brief, was over without them. Having signed the papers and raised their right hands and spoken a formal oath to support and defend the Constitution, to obey the orders of the President and of the officers appointed above them, the new soldiers drew their equipment. The ruffled uniform blue, though not always the same shade of blue, and not always the right size. The knapsack that would carry personal belongings, a change of shirt, a small sewing kit the Army called a housewife, a photograph or two, perhaps a small Bible or a book of some kind, a letter from someone at home already folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft, the haversack that would hold rations, the heavy rubber or tin canteen, the cartridge box and cap box on their belts, the bayonet in its leather scabbard, and the rifle itself, Most likely a Springfield rifle musket, a weapon of genuine quality that weighed nearly 9 pounds and stood nearly as tall as some of the shorter men who carried it. When everything was on and loaded, a Union infantryman walked under somewhere between 40 and 50 pounds, which sounded manageable until you consider marching with it for 15 or 20 miles through August heat or March mud, and then it sounded like something else entirely. The send-offs that accompanied the departure of regiments from their home states were large and often overwhelmingly emotional. Crowds gathered on the main streets. Bands played. Women had sewn regimental flags by hand. The stitches small and close, the colors brilliant. And the presentations of those flags to the men were formal occasions with speeches that tried to say what the flag meant and didn't quite succeed because it meant too many different things to too many different people in the crowd. Mothers stood near the front. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Old men stood very straight because they believed they recognized what this kind of departure looked like, having seen one in some earlier version of their own lives. The goodbyes at the edges of those crowds, in the doorways and on the street corners before the regiment formed up to march to the station, were rarely described in full by the men who experienced them. A handshake with a father that lasted a moment longer than a handshake usually does. An embrace with a mother or a sister or a sweetheart that had to be released before either party was finished with it. A younger brother standing on a porch step, watching, not yet saying anything because there wasn't anything to say. The specifics varied from man to man and family to family, but the shape of the experience was constant. Someone stepping out of his ordinary life and turning towards something enormous, and the people who loved him watching him go from the place he was leaving. Then the trains moved and the towns receded behind the windows, and the new soldiers found themselves crowded into the cars with the men of their company, strangers whose names they were still learning, whose faces they were learning to read, and the conversation that filled the first hours of the journey, nervous and joking and full bravado, with a hollow sound just underneath, was the first conversation of their new lives. The training camps they arrived at were, in the early months of the war, improvised and often chaotic. The United States Army had expanded in a matter of weeks from a small professional force of perhaps 16,000 men to something that was trying to be 10 times that size, and the organization had not kept pace with the ambition. Men were housed in open fields under canvas, in vacant fairground buildings, in any space that was near a railroad and could hold the number of men required. Equipment arrived slowly and sometimes arrived wrong. Rations were inconsistent. Officers were, in many cases, learning their duties at the same time the men under them were learning theirs, which gave the whole enterprise a quality that was simultaneously democratic and alarming. What every regiment did, regardless of where they were camped or who their colonel turned out to be, was drill, the manual of arms. The precise sequence of motions for loading and firing a rifle musket had to be performed until it lived in the body rather than the mind, because in battle the mind is not always fully available. Load, ram, cap prime, aim, fire. In ideal conditions, a trained soldier could fire 2 or 3 rounds a minute. In the first weeks of training, it took considerably longer, and the sergeants who conducted the drills were not inclined toward patience or philosophical discussion. The Army ran on rank, and rank required obedience, and the formal hierarchical obedience of military life was something most of these men had never encountered before. Not the loose authority of an employer, not the moral authority of a minister, but a structure in which orders were followed because they were orders and because the alternative had a name, and that name was insubordination. Some men chafed against this immediately. The American ideal of individualism, the belief, deep and cultural, that a man was answerable to himself before anyone else, sat badly against the reality of army life, where someone else decided when you slept and when you woke, what you wore and where you marched, and when you could eat and how you were expected to stand. Letters home from these early weeks are full of complaints about overbearing officers and bad food and the mind-crushing monotony of days in camp when nothing moved and nothing happened, and the hours stretched out like bad weather. And yet mixed into complaints, running quietly alongside them, was something else, a sense of belonging that grew slowly and without announcement, the weave of connection that forms between men thrown together by chance who are beginning, carefully, to choose one another, not because the other man is ideal, but because he is there and reliable and knows your name and will share what he has when what he has is very little. Out of shared boredom and shared bad food, and the long evenings talking around fires that were never quite warm enough, something was built, It did not have a word yet. It was assembling itself quietly, underneath everything else. Elisha Rhodes wrote about his messmates in the summer and fall of 1861 with an affection that accumulated in the diary entry by entry, the way genuine affection accumulates, not in a single moment of declaration, but in the repeated small noticing of specific things about specific people. Who was reliable? Who could be funny at exactly the right moment? Who kept his equipment in order, and whose equipment was always a shambles? Who you would want beside you, though none of them knew yet what beside you would actually mean. He was building something, a temporary life, constructed of uncertain materials on ground that might shift at any moment, but a life with its own small rhythms and its own real pleasures. The coffee in the morning, which was always the best thing, always the first priority. The letters from home, which were read and then folded away somewhere close to the body. The occasional evening when the camp was still and Virginia's sky went from pink to purple to a deep and early dark, and the sound of the camp softened and settled into something that was almost, for an hour, like peace. On the first morning of 1862, he opened his diary and wrote that he had never been happier. He had stood in a battle by then. He had buried men he knew. He was a different person than the young clerk who had boarded a train in Providence 7 months earlier. But he was still there, still writing, still paying close attention. And in the cold tent, in the cold Virginia January, surrounded by the vast sprawl and army that had been built in months out of farmers and clerks and mill workers and immigrants, he meant what he wrote. He was exactly where the pull of events had carried him, and he was, in some essential way, present. That was where it all began. Not in the smoke and not in the grief. Those came later, in their own time and their own weight, and they will find their own place in this story. It began in the summer, in the ceremony of departure, in the weight of a knapsack on shoulders that had never worn one, in the slow and complicated business of becoming a soldier when a month ago you had been something else. 3 million men did it. In the end, across 4 years, farmers and clerks and school teachers and dock workers and immigrants still learning the language, and boys who were not quite old enough, and men who were older than they had any business being. They signed their names and took their oaths and said their goodbyes and stepped onto trains heading south, into a war that none of them, not the most experienced, not the most frightened, not the most idealistic or the most practical, fully understood yet. But they went. That is the essential thing. They went. Somewhere in Northern Virginia, in the fall of 1861, a regiment of Ohio volunteers built a street. They named it, gave it an actual name, Ohio Street or Main Street, or something equally deliberate. And they laid out the company tents along it in rows precise enough to satisfy a surveyor, and they dug small drainage ditches along either side, because the ground in that part of Virginia had a tendency to become something close to soup when it rained, which it did with frequency that Ohio had not quite prepared them for. Some of the men gathered stones from a nearby creek bed and lined the pathways between the tents. 1 or 2 built rough furniture. A stool, a shelf of split boards nailed to a tent pole, a table low enough to use while sitting cross-legged on a rubber blanket. They swept the ground inside their tents in the mornings before inspection, which is a sentence worth reading twice. They swept dirt floors. They did it because the army required it, and because doing it made the small space feel, in some way that resisted precise explanation, more like a place a person actually lived. This was what the Civil War soldier spent most of his time doing. Not fighting. The popular imagination tends to compress 4 years of war into a series of battles, to see the whole thing as a sequence of tremendous events strung together with minimal connective tissue, which is very nearly the opposite of the truth. The truth is that an average soldier in either army spent a significant majority of his service in camp, waiting for orders, for supplies, for weather that would permit movement, for whatever the generals were deliberating over in their tents and farmhouse headquarters. Studies of the war's manpower suggest that a typical infantryman might spend only a few weeks in actual combat over the course of a 3-year enlistment. Everything else, the weeks that added up to months that added up to years, was camp. And camp as a way of life was something the men had to construct almost entirely out of their own ingenuity and their own need, because the army provided a structure but not a spirit, regulations but not contentment. And the distance between what was supplied and what was needed was filled daily by the men themselves. The physical world of Civil War camp had a quality that was both deeply familiar and profoundly strange. Familiar because the smell of wood smoke and the sound of men at their daily work are among the oldest smells and sounds human beings have made, and there was something in the organization of a regimental camp, the regularity of the tent rows, the fire rings, the routines that bracketed the hours, that recalled other kinds of settlement, other kinds of community. Strange because the whole thing could be struck in 2 hours and moved 20 miles down a road, and because everyone had understood, at some level they did not discuss directly, that it was temporary in a way that ordinary settlements were not, that it existed inside a parenthesis whose closing was uncertain. Picture the physical space. The shelter tents that most soldiers occupied by the middle years of the war were a relatively recent innovation. 2 half-tent sections, each carried by one man, buttoned together along the top, and staked to ground in an inverted V that was about 5 feet wide, and not much more than that in height, so that a man inside it was always crouching or lying flat. They were called, by the men who slept in them, dog tents. And the name was not meant as a compliment. In winter quarters, when a regiment stayed in one place long enough to justify the effort, these were often replaced by something more substantial. Small log cabins of 1 or 2 rooms, chinked with mud and topped with canvas roofs, heated by fieldstone fireplaces whose chimneys worked only partially, and whose warmth was consequently partial as well. The building of these winter quarters was itself a major operation, occupying whole regiments for days, the sound of axes and the smell of fresh-cut pine filling the cold air, while the men worked with a purposefulness that spoke not just of military industry, but to the plain human need for something that did not flap and let in the wind. Inside one of these winter huts, which a man might share with 3 or 5 or 7 others, depending on the size, the accumulated personal effects of the occupants gave the space a quality that visitors sometimes found unexpectedly moving. Photographs tacked to the log walls, the paper already beginning to yellow at the edges, a small shelf holding a tin cup, a pipe, a worn Bible with a name inked on the flyleaf, a spare pair of socks drying near the fire, a piece of carpet salvaged from a nearby farmhouse, placed on the dirt floor with a care that said something about what a man will do for the feeling of comfort when comfort is only available in its smallest and most portable forms. A playing card tucked into a tent pole, a dime novel with its cover torn off, a handful of letters in an old envelope. These objects were the private life of the Army. The public life, the official, regulated, inspected life, was something else. The Army's day began before dawn, with a drum or a bugle, which most soldiers came to regard with an antipathy that never faded across however many years they served. Reveille was followed by roll call, which was followed by breakfast, which was followed by the morning's drilling or fatigue duty, which meant 100 forms of labor that a regiment in camp required of its men, digging latrines and refilling old ones, cutting wood, hauling water, cleaning weapons, building roads and bridges, burying horses, and an apparently inexhaustible variety of smaller tasks that occupied the private soldier's time and confirmed, for anyone still in doubt, that military life was predominantly unglamorous. Then dinner, which was the main meal of the day, then more drill or more fatigue duty, then supper, then the long, early evening that was nominally free time, then tattoo roll call, then taps, and then the night. This was a structure, day after day and week after week. The actual content varied enormously by regiment and by officer, and by season, and by what phase of the war the Army happened to be in during active campaigns. The men marched and fought, and then marched again, and the rhythms of camp life were replaced by a different kind of exhaustion. But between campaigns, and especially in the long winters when armies on both sides went more or less stationary, this is what the days looked like: a set of fixed points between stretches of time that had to be managed, filled, survived. The food was a matter of continuous negotiation between what the Army issued and what the stomach required, and the two were not always obviously related. The standard Union ration, set by regulation and sometimes, though not always, delivered in something close to accordance with it, consisted of hardtack, salt pork or salt beef, coffee, sugar, and occasionally beans, rice, or dried vegetables. Hardtack was the staple and the most reliable of these, which is not the same as say it was reliable. It was a hard cracker made of flour and water and salt, baked until it had a texture similar to very dense wood, and issued in quantities that would theoretically provide sufficient calories if the soldier could find a way to make the eating of it bearable. Fresh from the barrel, It was hard enough to require soaking or breaking with a rifle, but after a few weeks in a soldier's haversack, it acquired populations of small weevils that the men referred to as worms, or, with the dark humor that was the Army's primary cultural product, as animated hardtack. One common approach was to soak the crackers in water and fry them in bacon fat, which produced something called skilly-gaily, which was at least warm. Another was to crumble them into coffee, which made the coffee worse, but the hardtack marginally more edible. Men who had been in the Army long enough to feel philosophical about it said there were only two things wrong with hardtack, which was that it was very hard, and that it was all there was. The salt pork and salt beef were preserved with so much salt that they required extended soaking before cooking, and the soaking did not always happen. And the beef in particular had a flavor and a texture that veterans described in terms suggesting that the animals from which it had been taken had not led happy lives. Confederate soldiers who captured Union supply wagons occasionally expressed disappointment at what they found, which said something significant about the relative states of the two armies' logistics. Coffee was the one indispensable thing, the one element of the ration that was almost universally beloved, and the men of both armies seemed to have been more united in their devotion to it than in almost any other area. A Union soldier's coffee ration was, by the standard of the era, genuinely generous, enough for 2 or 3 strong cups a day when properly rationed, and the men found ways to boil it under almost any circumstance. After a march, before March, in a driving rain with a fire that would not fully light, in the last hour before a battle when the hands were not entirely steady, and the coffee was perhaps the simplest thing to focus on, they carried it in tin cups and drank it black or sweetened with their sugar ration, and in the correspondence and diaries of the war, it appears so frequently and with such evident warmth that it is impossible to read that record without concluding that the coffee was, in some practical sense, load-bearing. It held something together, what the ration did not reliably provide: vegetables, fruit, fresh meat, bread that was soft enough to eat without engineering. The men supplemented through other means when they could. Foraging was technically regulated and theoretically limited to what commanding officers authorized, but in practice soldiers on either side foraged constantly, liberating chickens and sweet potatoes and ears of corn from the farms of the Virginia and Tennessee and Georgia countryside, with an efficiency that farmers found deeply unwelcome, and that the men themselves justified to the logic of necessity, which is usually available when needed. In towns near camp, sutlers, civilian merchants licensed to follow the army and sell goods to men, operated out of large wagons and later out of rough board storefronts that appeared and disappeared as the army moved. They sold canned goods and dried fruit and cheese and onions and small luxuries like tobacco and writing paper and needle and thread, charging prices that the men complained about constantly and paid constantly because the alternative was doing without, and doing without had its limits. There were also the packages from home. These arrived irregularly and were opened with a ceremony of genuine joy that was, among the minor recurrent events of camp life, perhaps the most reliably human. A box from a mother or a wife or a church auxiliary society might contain pickles, which kept well and cut through the monotony of salt pork with their sharpness. Dried apples, a piece of pound cake that had survived the journey in a tin, socks, which were always welcome, because socks wore out with remarkable speed in the field, and the Army's issued replacements were often too thin or the wrong size, a small bottle of something warming for the cold months, and always, folded small, a letter, which was the real thing, the thing the soldier looked for first even before whatever edible gifts were packed around it. The mail was among the most vital institutions in the life of the Civil War soldier, more important to morale than any speech or ceremony, and both sides worked hard to maintain it under conditions that made the working hard. Letters from home arrived folded and refolded, and sometimes water-stained from river crossings, or smudged from traveling in mail pouches that saw considerable use, and they were read, and then read again and tucked away somewhere close, in a breast pocket or a knapsack, and reread at intervals the way you return to something that remains true each time you check. A soldier's letter home had a particular character that shifted noticeably between the war's early months and its later years. The early letters are generally transparent, enthusiastic, detailed. The letters of men who are still surprised by everything around them and who feel that the act of describing it clearly will allow someone at home to see it alongside them. The later letters are more careful, more compressed, more interested in the particular than the general. They ask specific questions about specific people. They mention names. They talk about food and weather. They say a great deal. In some cases, by means of what they do not say, the empty space around certain subjects which any attentive reader might notice and might understand or might not, depending on what they needed to believe. Elisha Rhodes wrote home with unfailing regularity throughout his service, and his letters and diary together allow a remarkably full picture of what his days actually contained. In the months in camp, he records what he observed with the attentiveness that was his characteristic quality. The condition of the roads after a long rain. The state of the company's morale after a month of nothing happening. The men who had fallen ill, which was a constant and growing concern. The particular quality of a Virginia night, which was different from a Rhode Island night. Softer, he thought, darker, the stars seeming somehow more numerous, the sounds of the countryside at night carrying differently in the southern air. He noticed things and wrote them down without overstating them, which is its own form of precision. The evenings in camp, when they were not consumed by duty, had a richness that the men tended to remember with warmth even much later, even after everything else the war had given them to remember. Music was everywhere. Both armies went to war accompanied by regimental bands, and in the evenings, especially in winter quarters when the fighting had paused and the days had a settled quality, the sounds carried across the camps and sometimes across the no man's land between the armies, Union bands and Confederate bands answering each other, sometimes playing the same songs in a way that resolved, occasionally, into something nearly like a shared performance. The men on both sides knew the same songs because they had grown up with them. The popular melodies of the 1850s and early 1860s had filled parlors and church halls and the backs of boats on American rivers, and those songs did not stop being familiar simply because the men who knew them were now pointing guns at each other. Inside the camps, the informal music was at least as present as the formal regimental bands. Men who played fiddle or banjo or mouth harp, the harmonica, light enough to carry anywhere, became valuable members of their mess groups in a way that had nothing to do with military utility. A man who could play in the evenings, who could give the hours after supper a shape and a warmth, was worth more than anyone's official duties accounted for. Men who had no instrument at all sang, in small groups and large ones, the voices rising and carrying in the winter dark. Hymns and minstrel songs, and the new songs the war itself had produced, the Battle of the Republic, and When Johnny Comes Marching Home, and dozens of others that have not survived into general memory, but that were known by heart by every man who heard them once in camp. Cards were ubiquitous, despite the persistent attempt of chaplains to displace them with more improving entertainment. Poker and euchre and a game called Chuck-a-Luck, which involved dice, were played in the evenings with whatever was available to wager, which was sometimes money and sometimes food, and sometimes nothing except the investment of caring who won. Letter writing occupied men in the evenings who were not gambling or singing. The letter writers hunched over their knees or flat on their stomachs, with paper propped on a Bible or a drum, trying to say things clearly by the uncertain light of a tallow candle or a small fire. Reading was more common than might be expected of an army drawn heavily from rural and working-class populations, where formal schooling was uneven. Dime novels made their way through companies until they had been read to pieces. Newspapers, especially those from home, were passed through a mess group until every section had been read by every person. The Bible, which many men carried, was read in public and in private, and was carried not only for reading but for other reasons, some of which were protective, and some of which were comfort-seeking, and some of which were hard to articulate but were understood. What the men created out of all of this, the music and the cards and the letters and the swept dirt floors and the coffee at dawn, was a culture, a specific, temporary, improvised culture of remarkable resilience and depth, one that had its own humor, and its own language, and its own hierarchy of reputation that existed somewhat independently of the Army's official one. In this culture, the man who complained without doing anything about what he was complaining about was a nuisance. The man who was reliable, whose rifle was always clean, who kept his equipment in order, who held his position in a formation regardless of what was happening around him, was respected without necessarily being liked. The man who could make others laugh in difficult circumstances was worth something that did not appear on any official roster. And the man who shared his food or his tobacco or his overcoat on a cold night, who understood that in the arithmetic of the mess group the individual was less important than the group, was trusted in a way that outlasted the particular thing he had shared. This culture of sharing and mutual reliance, which the men rarely named and seldom analyzed, was what held the army together through the slow months between campaigns, through the illness and the boredom, and the nagging uncertainty about what any of this was building toward, and when it would end. It was also what made the loss of specific men, to disease, to battle, eventually, something more than statistical. When a man died in camp or in the field, he did not die as a unit of manpower, but as a known individual, as the man who played fiddle on Tuesday evenings, or who kept a photograph of his daughter tucked behind his cartridge box, or who had an extraordinary ability to locate drinkable water in country that appeared to have none. His absence was specific, and specific is always harder than general. Elisha Rhodes understood this. It runs through his diary like a quiet current, the accumulating weight of specific people who are present and then, at some point further along in the pages, are not. He does not dwell on it. He notes it and moves forward, because the army moved forward and you move with it, and the dwelling was something you did later, if you did it at all. The tents were struck and the temporary streets were abandoned and the rough log huts were left behind for whatever came next, their stones and their swept floors and their photographs tacked to the walls given back to the Virginia countryside, which reclaimed them in its own time and in its own manner, as it reclaimed everything. And the men who had built them shouldered their packs and fell into formation and moved out, carrying with them whatever had been assembled in the months of waiting. The knowledge of each other, the habits that had become reflex, the particular texture of a life that had been built from very little and had turned out, against some odds, to be enough. The road south was long, and the marching season was coming, and there was more ahead than most of them had room to contemplate just yet. But for now, in the long evenings of camp, the coffee was hot, the fiddle was going, the letters were written and folded and sealed with whatever came to hand. It was not home, but it had become, in the way that only time and shared necessity can make something the nearest available thing. Before a single major battle had been fought, before the armies of the North and South had met in anything more than a skirmish, the war had already begun killing men. It killed them in the training camps, in the late summer heat of 1861, in the very fields where they were learning to march and load and present arms with something resembling military precision. It killed them without drama or ceremony. It killed them in their tents, in the small hours of the morning, far from any enemy. It killed them with dysentery and typhoid fever and measles and pneumonia, and would go on killing them this way, by these means and others like them, in numbers that dwarf the casualty list of any battle for the entire length of the war. The figure that historians have settled on, imprecise as all such figures must be when the record is as old and is incomplete, is something close to 2 deaths from disease for every 1 death in combat. Across 4 years and several million men, that arithmetic produces a number so large it resists easy comprehension. More men died from illness in the Civil War than from bullets or artillery or any other weapon the two sides could bring to bear against each other. The great battles, Antietam, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor, the bloody engagements that fill the histories and the monuments and the long national memory of the war, were, in the dry language of mortality statistics, secondary to the quieter, slower, less photographable disaster that ran alongside them the entire time, almost unremarked, almost ordinary, like a river that floods every year, and is nevertheless astonishing every time. This is one of the truths about the Civil War that tends to be softened in the telling. Not because anyone is trying to deceive, but because it lacks the formal structure of tragedy. A battle can be described. It has a beginning and an end, positions and movements, moments of decision that can be mapped and analyzed and made comprehensible in retrospect. Disease has none of this. It arrives without announcement and progresses without clear logic, and it does not resolve in a way that offers much to narrate. A man is well, and then he is not, and the space between those two states is mostly confusion and discomfort and the long, slow work of a body either fighting its way back or not. The first disease to tear through the newly assembled regiments of 1861 was measles, which will seem anticlimactic until you understand conditions. A very large proportion of the men who enlisted, particularly those who came from rural areas, from farms and small towns where the pool of human contact was relatively small, had never been exposed to measles as children. They had no immunity to speak of when they were gathered by the thousands into close quarters of a training camp, sleeping side by side in tents, eating from shared utensils, moving to the same air day after day. Measles moved through them like weather. Company after company was knocked flat in the first weeks. Men who had been healthy and vigorous on the day of their enlistment physical were lying in improvised hospital ward a month later, burning with fever, covered in rash, unable to stand. Some recovered in a week or two, weakened but functional. Others developed complications. Pneumonia settling into lungs already taxed by the fever. Secondary infections taking hold in bodies that had used everything they had fighting the first assault. And a number of those men did not come back at all. The measles were followed or accompanied, or in some cases preceded by the diseases that would define the medical experience of the war's entirety. Dysentery, referred to in polite correspondence of the era as the bowel complaint, or sometimes simply as a complaint, as though it were too basic a human indignity to require further specification, was the most relentless of them. It accompanied the army everywhere it went, from the first camps of 1861 to the last campaigns of 1865, and it killed more men across that span than any single battle. It was, at its most serious, a misery that left a strong man unable to do anything but endure, depleting the body of fluid and nutrient with an efficiency that, combined with inadequate care and poor rations, could bring a man who had seemed fundamentally healthy to a state of critical weakness within days. The reasons for the dysentery and for much of the other intestinal illness the armies suffered were not, by the time of the Civil War, entirely unknown, or rather, the knowledge that existed was not being applied with anything like the consistency that would have made a difference. The germ theory of disease was taking shape in European laboratories in the 1860s. The slow and difficult work of scientists tried to establish what was genuinely causing illness rather than what tradition and received wisdom suggested. But it had not yet filtered down into the practical habits of armies in the field, where the gap between what the surgeons knew and what the men who dug the latrines and drew the water understood was still very wide. The latrines, which the army called sinks, were supposed to be positioned at a certain distance from the camp and from the water supply, and they were supposed to be covered and relocated regularly as they filled. In practice, they were often too close to where the men slept and cooked and drew their water. The same Virginia streams and Tennessee creeks that serve as a regiment's drinking water in the morning had frequently received the day's waste by the afternoon, and the men who drank from them in the evening did so in ignorance of the transaction that had taken place between the drinking and the drinking. They had no way to see what was in the water. It looked like water. It tasted more or less like water. And then, within a week or two, the result presented itself in the tent. In the early morning, in the long queues at the sinks that a man in reasonable health might see without much thought, but that a man already weakened by illness navigated with a particular combination of urgency and exhaustion that constitutes its own form of suffering. Typhoid fever was the disease the men feared most, and with reason. It came from the same source, contaminated water and food, but it progressed with deliberateness that set it apart. Where dysentery was immediate and obvious and violent, typhoid announced itself more slowly, with a headache that did not go away and a fever that climbed steadily over days, and then a prostration so complete that the men who had it were often unable to lift their heads. The characteristic rose-colored rash on the abdomen, the delirium that came as the fever peaked, men in the hospital tent speaking to people who were not there, calling names, carrying on conversations with a clarity that seemed from the outside almost normal until you understood that the conversation was happening entirely in the mind of the man having it. Some came through it, some did not, and the ones who did not generally died in the second or third week, when the body's long battle with the fever arrived at its conclusion. Malaria was a constant companion on the southern campaigns, spreading through the low, wet ground of coastal Virginia and the river valleys of Tennessee and Georgia. The men called it the ague, and its periodic fevers and chills were familiar enough by the middle years of the war that a man who came down with it might diagnose himself accurately and present himself to the surgeon's tent not with alarm, but with a kind of weary resignation. Quinine, the bark of the cinchona tree, long known to be effective against malaria, was issued in quantities and was sometimes taken voluntarily and sometimes required to be swallowed under observation because some men disliked its bitter taste sufficiently to avoid it when they could. The men who took their quinine regularly did better than those who did not, and this empirical fact was established by the Army's medical officers years before the mosquito's role in the disease's transmission was understood, which is its own small lesson in the history of medicine. Sometimes you know what works before you know why it works, and the knowing why, while it matters enormously, takes longer. Into this landscape of illness came the army surgeons, who are among the most misunderstood figures of the war. They have acquired a reputation, in the popular imagination, as butchers, men who amputated limbs as a first resort rather than a last, who performed their bloody work with callous speed, indifferent to suffering. This reputation is not entirely without foundation, but it is significantly distorted by the removal from context. The surgeons were, in the majority of cases, trained physicians who were doing their best under conditions of extraordinary difficulty with the knowledge available to them at the time. They amputated limbs with the frequency they did because the physics of the mini ball, the conical lead bullet fired by the Springfield and Enfield rifle muskets that equipped most Civil War soldiers, meant that a bullet striking an arm or leg tended to shatter the bone rather than passing cleanly through it, and a shattered bone in a limb, in the era before antiseptic surgery, had a very high probability of leading to infection, and then gangrene, and then death. An amputation performed within the first several hours after wounding, before infection had time to establish itself, gave a patient a significantly better chance of survival than any attempt to save a limb. The surgeons knew this because they had seen it repeatedly in the accumulated evidence of cases treated and outcomes observed, and they acted on what they knew. What they did not know, what was simply not yet available to them in anything close to a practical, systematic form, was the relationship between cleanliness and survival. They washed their hands sometimes, and not others. They moved from patient to patient with instruments that had been used on the previous patient, and rinsed, if rinsed at all, in water that was not particularly clean. They operated in field hospitals that were set up in barns and farmhouses and orchards, wherever space was available near the fighting. And the conditions of these spaces range from inadequate to genuinely alarming. It is one of the more melancholy ironies of the war's medical history that a great many men who survived their wounds died of what happened afterward, of the infections introduced not by the enemy, but by the very environment of their own care. The men understood this, at least instinctively, at least in a way that any population develops a collective understanding of which outcomes tend to follow which events. Going to the hospital was feared by Civil War soldiers. This is documented in their letters and diaries with consistency that makes it clear, not primarily because of the surgery, but because of what the hospital itself seemed to do to men. Soldiers who walked in sick sometimes walked out healthy, and soldiers who walked in with a wound that seemed manageable sometimes did not walk out at all. The word hospital carried weight in the Army's vocabulary, and not the weight of reassurance. The nurses who worked in these hospitals, and there were thousands of them, men and women, both volunteers and paid workers, working in the field hospitals near the fighting, and in the large general hospitals that the federal government built in Washington and Philadelphia and other northern cities, occupied one of the quieter stories of the war. Women who worked as nurses in the early years did so over the initial resistance of an army that found the idea unconventional, and they performed their work under conditions that were physically and emotionally demanding in ways that the romantic vocabulary of wartime service could not quite accommodate. They changed dressings and administered medicines and sat with dying men and wrote letters for men who could not write for themselves, and they did this for hours that had no reasonable limit, in spaces that smelled of carbolic and suppuration, and a particular sweetness that signaled infection. Walt Whitman, the poet, spent years in the Washington hospitals as a volunteer nurse, and recorded what he saw with the same unflinching openness that characterized everything he wrote. He brought gifts from his own pocket, fruit, tobacco, writing paper, and he sat and talked with the men, and he held the hands of men who were dying because someone had to and he was there. His accounts of the hospitals do not aestheticize what they saw, which was sometimes very hard to see, but they carry something else alongside the difficulty. A warmth, a genuine regard for the individual soldier in the individual bed, an insistence on seeing the specific person rather than the category. That insistence was, in the hospital environment, its own form of care, and the men responded to it in the ways that people respond when they feel genuinely seen. Elisha Rhodes knew the hospital, and he knew the illness that preceded it. His diary records the periods when illness came for him, the episodes of fever and digestive complaint that interrupted the routines of camp and march, with the same precise, unglamorous honesty that distinguished his writing generally. He did not dramatize his own suffering, and he did not minimize it either. He noted when he was sick, and he noted when he was better, and sometimes the entries in between are shorter than usual, the handwriting slightly less controlled, The observations reduced to essentials, as though the body's attention was elsewhere, and only a portion of it could be spared for the diary. Then, over a few days or a week, the entries fill out again, the sentences lengthen, the notice of the world beyond himself returns, and you can feel in the prose the return of whatever is that illness takes away. He was lucky on balance. Many of the men he had enlisted beside and trained beside and learned to know in the long months of camp were not. The roster of the 2nd Rhode Island, followed from its formation to the war's end, tells the story that all such rosters tell. The column of names accumulating against the column of outcomes, the causes of death-running disease alongside wound in proportions that reflect the war's true arithmetic. Typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, chronic diarrhea, which in the medical record of the era appears with a frequency that reveals how often a shorter and more violent illness became a long, slow diminishment, a body unable to fully recover, unable to fully succumb, existing in the space between. Men mustered out on medical grounds, sent home weakened in ways that persisted for years, that reshaped the remainder of their lives in ways they did not fully understand, and that no one thought to study in any systematic way until it was much too late for the studying to help them. What the soldiers made of the illness, emotionally and philosophically, was shaped by the world they brought with them into the army. Most of them had been raised in a religious culture that understood suffering as something that carried meaning, even when the meaning was not immediately visible. Letters home from sick men in hospital beds are often remarkably composed, not because the men were not afraid, but because they had a framework in which fear could be held. Providence, they called it. The older usage, the idea that events unfolded according to a design that a person might not comprehend from inside it. They surrendered to this idea with varying degrees of conviction and in varying degrees of articulation, but it was available to most of them when they needed it, a shape to put around what was shapeless. Some men found that illness did something to them beyond the physical, that it stripped away whatever they had been performing since enlistment, whatever version of courage or stoicism they had been maintaining for the benefit of the men around them, and left something quieter and more real underneath. Men wrote things in the sickbed that they had not written from the campfire. They asked for specific things, not abstract reassurances, but particular, the name of the dog, whether the kitchen garden had done well this year, what the youngest child was saying now. They wanted the texture home in the way you want it most when the thing most immediately around you is its opposite. Then the fever broke, or it did not. For those who came through, there was a slow return. The first meal eaten with something resembling appetite. The first walk outside the hospital tent on legs that needed to relearn their purpose. The strange, mild pleasure of a morning that was simply a morning, unremarkable and therefore temporarily miraculous. The men who recovered from serious illness reported a period of clarity afterward, a heightened attention to ordinary things that is familiar from any account of survival and convalescence, and that has something to do with having been, for a time, not entirely confident of one's own continuation. They went back to their regiments. They fell back into the rhythms of the camp, the drill and the fatigue duty, and the coffee at dawn, and the letters in the evening. The illness was noted in their service record and in some cases in their diaries and letters home, and then the days moved forward, as days will, and what had been urgent became something absorbed, something the body filed away without ceremony in whatever place it keeps the things that have happened to it and must now simply be carried. There would be more of it for most of them. The illnesses came and went across the months and the years of service, rarely catastrophic enough to end a man's war, but rarely absent for very long either, a persistent undertow in the larger current of the experience. The body was always negotiating with its circumstances, always doing its quiet work against the conditions it had been placed in. And the men whose bodies won that negotiation reliably, year after year, were the fortunate ones, and they knew it in the way that fortunate people always know it, and can rarely say so plainly without feeling the weight of who did not share in the luck. The ones who did not share are there too, in the records, in the rosters, in the hospital registers, and the letters that ended mid-correspondence and were never answered. They are there in the rows of small white markers in the national cemeteries that the federal government began establishing during the war itself, recognizing even in the middle of the fighting that the dead required an accounting and a place. Many of the graves in those cemeteries do not have a name. The stone says only unknown, a soldier of the Union, known but to God. The markers stood in long, quiet rows in the Virginia countryside, and the countryside went on being Virginia around them. The seasons turning, the light changing in a particular way that Virginia light changes through the year, and the names of what killed those men. The names that the stones did not record, but that the hospital registers held in their long columns of careful handwriting, were the names of ordinary things. Fever, diarrhea, pneumonia, the body, which is always ordinary, carrying what the war gave it as long as it could. The waiting was the worst part. This is what the veteran said. The men who had been through it more than once and had arrived at something like an understanding of their own fear. Not that the fear diminished with experience, but that you learned its shape, learned when it would arrive, and how long it would stay, and what it felt like when it began to lift. And the shape of it, they said, was the waiting, the hours before. Picture a summer morning in Virginia, in the second or third year of the war. The regiment has been on the march since before dawn, moving through darkness on roads that are nothing but a sensation underfoot. The sound of boots on packed earth, the clink of equipment, the occasional muffled voice from somewhere in a column, the breathing of men walking in column of fours so close together that you could reach out without fully extending your arm and touch the man beside you. Nobody speaks much. The silence in a column of men moving toward a fight is a particular silence. Not the silence of a camp at night or the silence of a winter morning before reveille, but a silence that has weight to it. That is the product of thousands of men each managing something private and not especially speakable. The sun comes up. The landscape takes shape around them. Rolling Virginia hills, wood lines, the occasional farmhouse with its windows dark and its yard empty. The people inside having already made the calculation about what the day was going to bring and having removed themselves from the vicinity. Smoke on the horizon. Not the familiar wood smoke of a cooking fire, but something thicker and darker. And then, somewhere ahead, the sound. Veterans called it many things over the years. A sound like distant thunder. A sound like the tearing of heavy cloth. A sound that seemed to arrive from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, and that the body registered before the mind had quite finished identifying what it was. Artillery. The battle was already going somewhere ahead, and they were walking toward it. The soldiers of the Civil War were not ignorant of what waited for them. By the second year of the fighting, the men in the ranks had accumulated enough experience and enough testimony from the men around them to have a reasonably accurate picture of what a battle looked and sounded and felt like from the inside. They knew about the smoke, which was among the most practically significant features of a 19th century engagement and one of the least discussed in the popular accounts. Black powder smoke, generated in enormous quantities by tens of thousands of rifle muskets and hundreds of artillery pieces, all firing as rapidly as possible, which accumulated over a field until visibility was reduced to the few feet immediately around a man, until formations broke down into small groups and then into individuals, each trying to orient themselves in a fog of their own making. They knew about the noise, which Veterans University described as indescribable and then attempted to describe anyway. The specific and different sounds of incoming and outgoing fire, which experienced soldiers learned to distinguish. The crack of a mini ball passing close enough to matter. The deeper thud of artillery shells. The strange and awful sound that a cannon shell made in the air above you that men described as sighing or singing or screaming, depending on the man and the day. They knew about the smell, sulfur and burned cotton and blood and turned earth, and the particular smell of fear, which is a real smell, chemical and animal, that fills a closed space and tells you things about the people around you that no other signal can. And knowing all of this, having heard it described, and having perhaps seen some version of it before, they walked toward it anyway. They walked toward it because the army moved, and they were part of the army, and because the men on either side of them were walking toward it, and because stopping or turning around was something that had a name and consequences, and because most of them, at some level that was not exactly courage and not exactly the absence of choice, understood that this was a thing they had signed up for, that everything before this morning, the training, the marching, the long months in camp, the illness and the boredom and the letters and the coffee at dawn, had been preparation for this, and that not going would have been a kind of lie about who they were. There was usually more waiting after the column stopped. The regiment deployed from column into line, a practice movement, drill made automatic through months of repetition, and then stood in that line, perhaps in a wood line at the edge of a field, perhaps in a road screened by a ridge, and waited for whatever came next. These were, by many accounts, among the most difficult minutes of the experience. The body had been preparing itself since before dawn, had been moving, had been occupied by the act of marching, and now it was still, and the stillness gave the mind room to do things that movement had suppressed. The sounds ahead were clearer now. The smell was on the air. Officers moved behind the line on horseback or on foot if the situation did not call for horseback, saying things to the men that varied from officer to officer and moment to moment, practical instructions about what was about to happen, or words of encouragement that landed differently depending on who was saying them and who was hearing them, or nothing at all, because some officers understood that silence was more honest than anything available to say. The men stood and waited and did the things that men waiting in that specific situation have always done. They checked their equipment. Not because it needed checking. Most of them had checked an hour ago in the dark, but because the hands needed something to do while the rest of the body held still. They spoke to the man beside them about small things, about nothing particularly. The conversation serving the purpose that conversation always serves when its actual subject is the management of time and the management of the self inside it. Some men prayed, silently or in a murmur, their lips moving, their eyes open or closed depending on the person and the habit. Some men found, in those minutes, that the praying came very naturally, that whatever distance they might have maintained from it in ordinary life was no longer relevant, that the specific calculus of standing here in this field on this morning admitted a very different approach to the question of what one reached for. Some found that nothing they reached for was available, that the waiting was simply waiting and had to be endured without assistance of any kind. And then, at some point, the order came, and the line began to move. What happened next is what every memoir and letter and diary written by a Civil War soldier struggles to convey, and what most of them eventually concede cannot be fully conveyed. That the experience of moving across a field under fire was something that existed in a different category from the rest of human experience, and that the words available for describing human experience did not quite apply to it. Not because the words were insufficient in some abstract way, but because the experience itself dismantled certain basic organizing structures of consciousness. The sense of linear time, the capacity for sustained thought, the ability to hold a complex intention in mind and act on it, and left something simpler and more immediate in their place. The noise was the first thing. Up close, a battle was as loud as anything a human being was likely to encounter in the 19th century, louder than any factory or thunderstorm or crowd, a noise that was not just heard but felt, that lived in the chest and behind the eyes, that made normal thought temporarily unavailable. Men who had been in combat described thinking in very short sentences afterward, not because they were unlearned or incapable of complexity, but because the noise had reduced the available cognitive territory to something that could accommodate only essentials. Move forward. Stay with the man beside you. Load. Fire. The smoke came up almost immediately once the firing started, and within a few minutes of serious engagement, the field was transformed into a gray-white fog through which men moved and fired at targets they could often see only partially. A shape, a muzzle flash, the suggestion of a line. Formations that had been reasonably orderly at the start of the advance were broken down by the smoke and by the ground, by fences and ditches and ravines and wood lines that the maps had not quite accounted for, and by the casualties that began to appear in a line almost in the first moments of serious fire. A man went down beside you, and the instinct to stop to help had to be overridden by training and by the simple mechanical pressure of the men behind you continuing to advance, which pushed the line forward by collective momentum as much as by individual decision. The man beside you went down and you stepped over him or around him and you kept moving, and what that cost was something you did not pay in the moment because the moment did not have currency for it. You paid it later, in whatever later turned out to mean. The men who carried the regimental flags, the color guard, who were selected for their steadiness and their courage, and who were not supposed to fire their weapons, but simply keep the flag moving forward and upright, were the most exposed men on the field, and they knew it, and the men around them knew it. And the colors were also the navigation system of the regiment in the smoke and chaos, the fixed point by which individuals and small groups oriented themselves when everything else had dissolved. When a color bearer went down, and they went down at extraordinary rates, because the enemy knew what the flag meant and aimed for it, the flag was taken up by the next man, and then the next, and the flag kept moving, because the regiment moved with it, and the regiment moving with it was a thing that had to be maintained. Elisha Rhodes was in the fight at First Bull Run in July of 1861. which was among the first major engagements of the war, and was also among its most chaotic. A battle that began with the Union forces in what seemed like a commanding position, and ended in a retreat that became, for a portion of the army, a rout. The roads back toward Washington clogged with soldiers and with the civilians who had ridden out from the capital in their carriages to watch what everyone assumed would be a Union victory, and found themselves instead in the middle of a military disaster. Rhodes wrote about it in his diary with the shaken precision of a young man reporting faithfully on something he did not yet have a sufficient context for, noting what he observed around him. The noise, the confusion, the collapse of the line, the long, frightened walk back in the dark, without quite arriving at a conclusion about what it meant. He would have more chances to understand it. He fought at Antietam in September of 1862, which holds the distinction of being the bloodiest single day in American military history. A day when the armies lost somewhere in the vicinity of 20,000 men killed, wounded, or missing between dawn and nightfall, in a battle that ground through a cornfield and a sunken road and a stone bridge over a creek called Antietam, names that would carry their own weight in the national memory for as long as the memory lasted. He fought at Fredericksburg, where the Union Army was sent across an open field against Confederate positions on high ground behind a stone wall, and was, in the most straightforward terms available, slaughtered, the men advancing in wave after wave, knowing what had happened to the waves before them and going anyway, and the stone wall holding, and the field after the battle being among the most desolate things any of the survivors ever described. He was in the Wilderness Campaign in 1864, in the dense Virginia forest where the smoke of battle combined with the smoke of burning undergrowth. The black powder fire had set the trees alight, and men on both sides who had been wounded and could not be moved from the field died not from their wounds but from the fire, and the sound of that came through the smoke to the men still fighting, and the men still fighting went on fighting. He kept writing through all of it. The diary is not graphic. He is not, by temperament or by the conventions of the era's private writing, given to extended description of the violence he witnessed. What he records is more often the emotional and physical aftermath, the exhaustion that settled on the body after a battle, like something denser and more comprehensive than ordinary tiredness, occupying not just the muscles but some deeper register, the places that sleep was supposed to reach. The inventory of who was still there and who was not, the sense of the ground itself, of the particular field or road or woodline where the fighting had happened, as something changed, as somewhere that was now different in a way that was hard to articulate but impossible to be unconscious of. That quality of the ground was something that many veterans noted, and it appears in account of the war with enough consistency to suggest it was not merely literary. A field where men had died in numbers had a particular quality to it afterward, and the men who moved through it in the first hours after a battle, retrieving the wounded, beginning the work of burying the dead, moved through a particular silence, a quietness that was not just the absence of gunfire, but the presence of something else, some collective acknowledgement of what had happened here in the preceding hours. The work of burying was not glamorous and was not discussed much in the accounts of the war written later for popular audiences, but occupied a great deal of the time of men in both armies, and left its own kind of mark. The dead of both sides had to be gotten into the ground quickly, for practical reasons that anyone who has been near a battlefield and warm weather will understand without requiring elaboration. The burial parties worked through the nights after major engagements, moving across fields that were littered with the evidence of the fighting, ruptured equipment, abandoned rifles, the detritus of what had been a few hours before an army in motion. They dug long trenches, because individual graves took too much time and there were too many men to be buried, and there was no certainty of how long they had before the army moved again and left them to finish or leave the work undone. The identification of the dead was inconsistent to the point of being nearly non-existent in the war's early years. No dog tags, no standardized method of recording who a man was before placing him in the ground. Some men, foreseeing this problem with a practicality that says something about the kind of thinking the war produced in those who gave enough thought, wrote their names and regiments on slips of paper and pinned them to the inside of their uniforms before a battle. Some wrote their names on their skin with ink or with the blunt end of a cartridge. This was not an official practice. It was something men arrived at themselves by the informal shared reasoning that characterized the Army's culture at its most human, the collective working out of a problem that the institution had not yet solved. The letters that arrived in the weeks after a major battle, the condolence letters from officers and from messmates, written to the families of men who had been killed, form one of the more extraordinary documentary bodies of the war. They are uniformly careful and uniformly kind, written by men who were themselves exhausted and themselves grieving, trying to give the family of the dead man something to hold. They are careful to say that the death was quick, that the man did not suffer, even when neither of those things was certainly true, because the alternative, the accurate description of what a battle actually did to bodies, was not something a letter could contain, and not something a family, already in grief, needed to carry. The letters say, he died bravely. He died, well, he spoke of home. They create a shape for the death that those at home could live with, which was a form of mercy, and which was also, like many mercies, a form of silence around the thing itself. After a battle, and then another battle, and then another, the men who survived underwent a change that they rarely described in any systematic way, but that emerges clearly from the accumulated record of their letters and diaries. The change visible in the comparison between early writing and late. The early writing, as noted before, is observant and often emotionally transparent. The writing of men surprised by their own experience and reporting it faithfully. The later writing is more compressed, more selective, less interested in conveying the full texture of events and more focused on specific and particular. The man beside me, the condition of my boots, whether the mail has come. It is not that the men became less intelligent or less feeling. It is that they became more careful with themselves, more economical, conserving something that a certain kind of openness had been spending. This change was understood by the men themselves, at least partially, and was regarded with a mixture of regret and acceptance. Some wrote about it directly, noting that they had become, in some way they could point to but not entirely explain, different from the person who had enlisted. Not worse, necessarily. Not better. Different. In the specific way that a tool is different after it has been used for its actual purpose, as opposed to the way it felt in your hand when it was new and you were imagining what the using would be like. The afternoons after battles, the evenings of the day on which the fighting had happened, when the armies had pulled back to wherever they had pulled back to and the guns had stopped and the field was quiet, had a quality that survivors returned to again and again in their memories of the war. A terrible quiet, some of them called it. A profound quiet. A quiet that was not peaceful because of what it followed and what it contained, but that was quiet nonetheless. The sudden absence of the noise that had filled the hours since morning like water filling a vessel, and now the vessel was empty. And the emptiness was as loud in its own way as the fullness had been. The men ate what they had, if they had anything. They saw to their wounded, and they counted who was missing, and they cleaned their rifles, because that was what you did. It was a thing that the hands knew to do when everything else was uncertain, and the cleaning was automatic, and the automaticness was its own form of comfort. They wrote in their diaries. Sometimes, those who had diaries, the entries short and sometimes barely legible, the handwriting recording the state of the hands. They lay down on the ground, which was still warm in summer, and held the warmth for a while after the sun was down, and they slept with particular density of the genuinely exhausted, not peaceful sleep, not always, but deep, the body insisting on its own recovery whether the mind was ready to consent or not. And in the morning they rose, because the army rose, and the coffee was made, and the roll was called, and the names to which no one answered were noted, and the day continued forward in the direction that days continue, which is always forward, always into whatever the next thing happened to be. It is one of the stranger aspects of the war's emotional reality, that the ordinary machinery of daily life did not stop for battles, that the rhythms of camp and march and ration and letter persisted directly alongside the violence, so that a man might be in a battle on a Wednesday afternoon and writing home on Thursday morning in terms that were almost, if you did not read carefully, domestic. Elisha Rhodes wrote after Antietam. He noted who had been lost. He described the condition of the regiment, the number of casualties, the state of the equipment, the fatigue that saddened the body like something with physical weight. And then, with the economy that had become characteristic of his diary by the second year, he turned to the next thing, which was the business of whatever came after Antietam, which was more marching and more waiting and the long autumn slowing of the campaign, as both armies pulled back to their winter positions and the guns went quiet for a season. He was still there, still writing. The sound of the thing had passed through him, and he had come out the other side, changed in whatever way it changed a person, and he was still there. That was not a small thing. In the arithmetic of the war, it was, in fact, everything. There is a letter in the archives of the Rhode Island Historical Society, written in the autumn of 1862 by Elisha Rhodes to his mother, that runs to 4 careful pages in his small, even hand. He describes the weather, which had turned cold early that year, and the state of his uniform, which needed attention in several places he specifies in practical detail. He asks about his sisters by name. He mentions the names of 2 men in his company. One who has been ill and is improving, one who has not been seen since Antietam, and whose family he worries about in a way he does not elaborate on, but does not need to. He says he is well. He says the regiment is in good spirits. He says he thinks of home often and with great warmth, and he asks to give his regard to a number of people whose names follow on a list that has the quality of a man walking through a familiar place in his mind, touching each thing to confirm it is still there. He does not say what Antietam looked like, or sounded like, or what it did to him. He does not describe the field or the sunken road, or the men who went down in the cornfield in the first light of that September morning. He does not say how many men from his regiment he helped bury, or what that work felt like, or what he thought about while he was doing it. He was not hiding these things from his mother. Exactly. He was making a choice that thousands of soldiers made in thousands of letters across 4 years of war, the choice about which direction the letter should face, toward what was here, or toward what was there, toward the honest account of the experience, with everything that would arrive in the envelope along with it, or toward the known world at home, the names and the weather and the practical details, the surface of things that allowed a letter to serve as a kind of bridge rather than a document of what was happening on the other side of the distance. Most soldiers chose the bridge, most of the time, and their mothers and wives and sisters and fathers generally understood this in the way that people understand things they have agreed, without discussion, not to press. The letter was, for these men, one of the primary instruments of survival. Not physical survival, but the subtler kind, the maintenance of the self across the months and years of a life that was, in most respects, nothing like the life that self had been built in and for. To write a letter home was to perform a kind of orientation, to locate yourself by triangulation between where you were and where you came from, to confirm that the person writing was still in some meaningful relationship to the person who had left. This is why the letters were written with such frequency and such care, even by men who had never been regular correspondents before the war, men whose pre-war writing might amount to a handful of business letters and a few formal social notes. The war made writers of a great many people who had not previously understood themselves to have anything particular to say. What they were writing toward, in addition to the specific people at home, was a future in which they were not soldiers. This future was present in the letters as an assumption more than a subject, rarely discussed directly, because to discuss it directly was to make it feel contingent, to hold it up to a light that might reveal its uncertainty, but present nonetheless, in the way the letters asked about the farm or the business or the children, in the way they offered opinions on neighborhood matters and family decisions and the price of things, as though the writer were still in some sense a participant in ordinary life, as though the parenthesis of the war were already understood to be a parenthesis and not the thing that replaced everything that came before it. The letters they received were held with similar care. A letter from home, arriving at the mail call, that was one of the most reliably observed rituals of camp life, was handled differently from any other object in the soldier's possession. It was not opened immediately, generally, if there was an alternative, not in the press of the crowd at mail call, not in the first rush of everyone else opening theirs. It was put away somewhere close to the body and opened later, in whatever privacy the camp made available, which was rarely complete privacy, but was at least the relative quiet of an evening when the immediate duties were done and the tent had settled into its nighttime configuration and the light from outside had softened enough to give the space a quality that was almost interior, almost contained. The reading was often slow and often repeated. Men read letters from home 2 and 3 and 4 times, not because they had forgotten the contents, but because the contents carried something beyond information, something that the information was a vehicle for, and that required multiple readings to receive. Then the letter was folded and put away in whatever was serving as a repository for letters, the breast pocket, the knapsack, a small waterproof wallet if the man was organized enough to have one, and it traveled with its owner from that point forward, becoming part of the equipment, one of the things that defined the specific weight of a specific man's pack. The religion of the Civil War soldier was, like almost everything else about the inner life of the Army, more various and more complicated than the simple picture of a Christian army at prayer that certain accounts of the war have tended to supply. There were in both armies men of genuine and sustaining faith, men for whom the religious framework they had carried into the war held up under the weight of what the war put on it. Men who prayed regularly and meant it, and found in the praying something that steadied them in ways they could not always have articulated, but did not need to articulate because the steadying was itself the point. There were revival meetings in Confederate Army, particularly in the Army of Northern Virginia in 1863, that were extraordinary in their scale and their apparent emotional intensity. Tens of thousands of men being baptized in Virginia rivers and creek beds, the religion arriving like a wave through whole divisions, the chaplains barely able to keep pace with the demand. The Union armies had their own version of this, less dramatic, but no less real for the men involved. There were also men for whom the war did something to the faith they had brought into it, not necessarily destroying it, not always even diminishing it, but changing its character, making it more personal and less institutional, more intimate with doubt, and therefore, in some cases, more rather than less real. A man who had knelt beside a dying friend in a field hospital and prayed, and watched the friend die anyway, had a different relationship to prayer afterward than a man whose prayers had been a regular and unchallenged feature of an ordered life. What he did with that difference varied enormously. Some men arrived at a faith that was, as one might say, harder won and therefore harder to shake. Some men arrived at a silence on the subject that was not quite disbelief and not quite belief, and that they maintained until the end of their lives without needing to resolve it. The chaplains who served the regiments of both armies were as varied in quality and character as the men who filled any other role in any large institution assembled quickly from available materials. The best of them were present in the way that Whitman was present in the hospitals, alert to the specific man in the specific moment, unbothered by the gap between the formal requirements of their role and the informal, human, often ungainly reality of what the men around them actually needed. They sat with the sick and the dying. They wrote letters for men who could not write. They conducted burial services over graves that were sometimes properly dug and marked and sometimes were not, saying the words in both cases, because the words were for the living as much as the dead, and the living needed them regardless of the conditions. The worst chaplains were rarely present at all, which the men noticed and recorded in their letters with a dry humor that was the Army's preferred register for its disappointments. That humor, the particular dark and laconic quality of Civil War soldier humor, was itself a form of survival strategy, and a remarkably sophisticated one. It operated on the principle that the most effective way to manage an experience that could not be made small was to treat it as though it were smaller than it was, to speak about it in a register that refused to grant it the weight it was trying to apply. A soldier who referred to incoming artillery fire as those damn singing birds was not trivializing what the fire was doing to men around him. He was performing a kind of psychological judo, using the fire's own momentum to put it somewhere he could hold it. The humor ran through the letters and diaries of the war as a constant undercurrent, surfacing in anecdotes about incompetent officers and improbable rations and the various indignities of the soldier's life that were genuinely funny and were described as funny not because the men were incapable of taking them seriously, but because the alternative to laughing was something that consumed more of a man than he could afford to spend. Soldiers made jokes about hardtack that would have been cruel if they had been made by anyone who had not spent months eating it. They made jokes about the mud of Virginia with a specificity of observation that revealed how attentively they had studied it. They made jokes about death with a casualness that people who had not been where they had been sometimes mistook for callousness, and that was, in fact, something considerably more complicated. The use of language as a way of maintaining a functional relationship to a reality that language was not quite adequate to. The mess group, the small unit of 5 to 8 men who cooked and ate together, who shared a tent or a section of a tent, who pooled their rations and their equipment and their collective ingenuity, was a primary social unit of the soldier's world, the level at which the Army became personal. Everything above the mess group, the company, the regiment, the brigade, the corps, the Army of the Potomac, or the Army of Northern Virginia, was an abstraction, something a soldier belonged to but did not live inside in any daily, textured sense. The mess group was where the living happened. It was where the food was cooked and the coffee was made, and the cards were played, and the arguments were had, and the silences were shared. And it was a scale at which men were known as individuals rather than as types. The bonds formed in mess groups had a quality that the men themselves often reached for unusual language to describe. Closer than friendship, they sometimes said, and different from it, something that had been made by conditions that ordinary friendship did not involve and that therefore occupied a different category. You had been cold together and hungry together and frightened together and bored past the ordinary human tolerance for boredom together. And what came out of that shared experience was something adhesive in a way that other relationships tended not to be, something that did not require maintenance in the usual sense, because it had been built on a foundation that the ordinary social requirements of maintenance could not reach. When a man in a mess group was killed or died of illness or was transferred or discharged, the loss was felt at the specific, personal level before it was felt at any other. The regiment had lost a man, and the company had lost a man, and these facts were noted in the official records. But what the surviving men experienced was a loss of a particular person, the man who had always taken the first watch without being asked, or who could make everyone laugh at exactly the wrong moment in exactly the right way, or who was a reliable and uncomplaining presence through the long marches that wore at everyone's patience and composure. The absence was specific, and it left a specific shape in the group, and the group reorganized itself around that shape the way any living thing reorganizes around a wound, not erasing what was there, but growing around and past it, with the evidence of it still visible if you knew what you were looking at. Elisha Rhodes wrote about these men with the accumulating tenderness of someone who was paying close attention over a long time. The names appear in a diary and then reappear, each subsequent mention adding something to the picture, a detail about the man's character, a report of his health or his spirits, a note about something he said or did that struck Rhodes as worth recording. And then, at some point in the pages, a name stops appearing. Sometimes there's a direct notation of why. Dead of disease, wounded and sent to hospital, transferred, discharged. Sometimes the name simply does not recur, and the absence is itself the information, and you read around it the way you read around any silence in a text, trying to understand what the silence is made of. The transformation that came over these men, the change that accumulated across the months and years of service, until it was visible in the difference between how a man wrote in 1861 and how he wrote in 1864, was not a simple change and did not have a simple name. It was not the loss of innocence in the clean narrative sense that literary convention makes available, not a single event with before and after. It was something slower and more diffuse, a gradual reorientation of the self toward a different set of priorities and a different set of understandings, driven by the cumulative weight of experience rather than by any single experience in particular. The men who went through it generally became quieter, in one sense or another, not necessarily in the literal sense of speaking less, though some did, but quieter in the sense of making less noise about themselves, claiming less space in the emotional and philosophical register, letting a great deal pass without comment that earlier they might have commented on. Whether this was wisdom or suppression or some combination of the two that does not have a clean name is a question that the historical record cannot fully resolve, because the men themselves did not resolve it, and most of them would not have found the question particularly useful even if someone had thought to ask it in those terms, which no one really did. What they became was practical in a deep and specific way. The word practical does not quite capture it, but it is the nearest available word. They had been tested against reality in the most direct manner available, the reality of their own bodies in bad weather, of their own minds in situations of extreme difficulty, of their own character when the character was required to carry its full weight without any of the social scaffolding that normally makes that carrying easier, and they had arrived at a very clear understanding of what they were made of and what that was good for. Some of what they discovered in themselves was reassuring, and some of it was not, and both kinds of discovery had to be absorbed and integrated into a self that continued to function, to march and drill, and write letters and make coffee, and do all the 100 daily things that persisted regardless. The inner life that resulted was, in many cases, richer and more complex than the one they had brought into the army, but it was also more guarded. There are things you can see in the late letters of Civil War soldiers that were not visible in the early ones, a greater capacity for observation, a deeper attention to the specific and the human, an ability to sit with uncertainty without requiring it to resolve. And there are things that are not there that were there before, a kind of easy openness, a willingness to declare, a confidence in one's own judgment that had not yet been tested against what judgment looks like when the consequences of getting it wrong are immediate and irreversible. Elisha Rhodes, by the autumn of 1863, was no longer the young clerk from Providence who had opened his diary in the summer of 1861 with the slightly formal attentiveness of a person who understood he was beginning something important. He was still attentive, still careful, still possessed of the quiet precision that was his characteristic quality. But he was a different kind of attentive, less surprised, more knowing, writing from a place that had been earned rather than assumed. He had been made a first lieutenant by then, and then a captain, moving upward to the regiment's officer ranks as the men above him were killed or promoted or discharged. The war generating its own promotions in the way that wars do, making room at the top by removing the people who were already there. He wore his rank with the same restraint that he wore everything else. The diary does not become more important when he becomes an officer, which is itself a form of character. There are men in whose diaries of promotion the officer dominates everything around it, the tone shifting into something more official, more aware of its own significance. Rhodes simply continues noting what he observes, with the same care and the same economy, the new responsibilities absorbed into the account alongside the coffee, and the weather and the names of the men. He had become, across 3 years of war, a professional soldier in a way he had not been and had not expected to become. Not in the sense of having lost a civilian self, but in the sense of having developed a competence so thorough and so deeply integrated that it was no longer separable from who he was. He knew how to move men, and how to read ground, and how to calculate the relationship between an order and its consequences in a way that the school books on military science had gestured at, and that the actual experience of the thing had made visceral and certain. He knew what the men under him needed, because he had been one of those men, and he had needed it himself. He still wrote to his mother. He still wrote in his diary. The letters home still turned toward the domestic, toward the names and the weather and the practical matters, and the diary absorbed what the letters left aside, and together they made a record that was, in its accumulation, a portrait of a person changing, not into someone unrecognizable, but into someone who had been extended by everything that had happened in a direction that the person he had been could not yet have pointed toward, but that the person he was becoming understood as, if not exactly home, at least the kind of ground he knew how to stand on. Outside, the Virginia evenings were taking on the particular quality of Virginia evenings in the fall, the light going amber and then gold, and then a bronze that had almost too much color in it, the way the light in that part of the world sometimes seems to be showing off, and the air cooling rapidly once the sun was below the tree line, carrying the smell of dried leaves and wood smoke, and the particular freshness that comes after rain has cleared, and the sky has gone to deep blue of late. Afternoon. Inside the tent, a man wrote. The pen moved steadily across the paper, the hand sure, the sentences finding their own pace. Outside, the camp settled into its evening rhythms, familiar and predictable, the sounds assembling themselves into the texture of a life that had become, against most of the original expectations, simply as life. He folded the letter when it was done and sealed it, and addressed it in the careful hand that the archive would later preserve, and put it with the others that would go out with the morning's mail. Then he put out the candle and laid down in the dark, and the camp went on around him, and the Virginia night came on with an accustomed quiet, and whatever he carried in his chest, the weight of what he'd seen and done and lost, the warmth of what he still held, went with him into sleep. In the spring of 1865, somewhere in Virginia, a soldier sat down and tried to understand that it was over. Not the sitting down, that was easy enough. The understanding was the harder part. For years is a long time to be inside something, long enough that the inside of it becomes simply the world, becomes the only world there is, and the news that the world has changed, that the thing you've been living inside has ended, and you are now expected to step back out into whatever was there before, arrives with a quality that is less like relief than like a kind of confusion. The men who had enlisted in the summer of 1861 had been, at that point, civilians for the entirety of their previous lives. They were civilians no longer. They were something else, something the country did not yet have a fully adequate word for, and the war had taken long enough that it was not entirely clear the old word still applied to them either. Elisha Rhodes heard the news of Lee's surrender at Appomattox on the 9th of April, 1865, while his regiment was in the field. He was 23 years old. He had been a soldier for nearly 4 years. He had been in more battles than he could count without the diary in front of him, had been promoted through the ranks to the position of colonel, commanding the 2nd Rhode Island Volunteer Infantry. the regiment he had joined as a 19-year-old clerk with no military experience and an uncertain idea of what he was walking into. He wrote in his diary that evening. The entry is not long. He noted the news, noted the celebrations in the camp, noted the quality of the evening. He wrote that he felt it impossible to realize that the war was really over. That word, realize, is the right one. The war had been real in the most immediate and physical sense available. The kind of real that lives in the body, that cannot be argued with or revised or left behind when you turn your attention to something else. And now it was supposed to be over, which was also supposed to be real. And the two realities were not yet the same size, and the night was not long enough to make them so. The weeks that followed Lee's surrender had a strange, suspended quality that many veterans described later with the same searching language, a sense of being between things, in a space that had opened between a life that had just ended and the life that had not yet begun. The armies did not simply dissolve. They marched, some of them, a grand review in Washington in May of 1865. 2 days of Union armies moving down Pennsylvania Avenue past crowds of people who had come from everywhere to see them, the kind of spectacle that the Capitol had not seen before and would not see again. The men marched in good order, as they had learned to march, column after column, regiment after regiment. The flags at the front of each unit carrying the names of their battles stitched into fabric, the record of where the regiment had been, what it had done, who it had buried along the way. The crowd watched, and some of them wept, and some of them cheered, and the men in the columns looked straight ahead and put one foot in front of the other the way they had been doing for 4 years and would do in the hours remaining for the last time. Then, by companies and regiments, they were mustered out. The mustering out was a bureaucratic process, as most things were in the Army. Papers filed, equipment returned, final pay calculated and dispersed, the name written one last time in the regimental records with its final notation, the discharge. The men who had been 3 million, who had filled the roads and the river crossings of half a continent and had made noise that was audible for miles, folded themselves back into the country they had come from, a few at a time. In the weeks and months that followed the surrender, the army dispersed in the way smoke disperses after the fire is out, gradually, and then almost all at once, and then gone. What they returned to was familiar in a way that a place you have been away from for a long time is familiar, which is to say, familiar and also strange, the familiarity wearing unevenly over the strangeness in a way that takes time and patience to smooth out. The towns they had left were recognizably the same towns. The houses were where the houses had been. The people, most of them, were still there, older now by 4 years, which was not a trivial amount of time in a century when people aged as they did. A mother had gone gray or grayer. A younger sibling had become, in the soldier's absence, something other than the child he remembered. A girl who had been a girl when he left was, in all respects, a woman now, and the relationship they had maintained through letters, which had been a real relationship, had been important to both of them, had in some cases been what one or both of them held on to through very difficult periods, was now a relationship between people who were somewhat different from the people who had started it. And the renegotiation of that was sometimes easy and sometimes not. The homecomings themselves were rarely the things that had been imagined in the long months of absence, because imagined things and actual things are always different, and the longer the imagining and the more specific it has been, the more vivid the difference tends to be. A man who had spent 4 years picturing a particular room in a particular house at a particular time of day found, upon returning, that the room was real and the house was real and the time of day was achievable, but that the thing he'd been picturing was not quite the place itself, but some essential distillation of it that had served, in the field, as a kind of anchor, and that the actual place, with its actual smells and sounds, and the actual people in it being actually themselves, was both more and less than what the picture had been. More because it was real. Less because the picture had been perfect and reality is never perfect. And the gap between the two was something that took time for some men to close. Some of them could not close it, or not quickly. The men who came back most quietly, who slipped back into the fabric of their communities with the least apparent difficulty, were not always the men who had carried the war the most lightly. They were sometimes the men who had learned, in 4 years, to carry things without showing that they were carrying them. The same skill that had allowed them to write those careful letters home, to turn their correspondence toward the domestic and the specific, to give their mothers and wives what their mothers and wives needed while absorbing everything else somewhere less visible. They came home and they went to work and they married or resumed their marriages and they sat at dinner tables and talked about the things that dinner tables required. And what they did not talk about was simply not talked about. And the years went by. There were also the men who could not, who came back from the war so altered, so thoroughly remade by what they had experienced, that the ordinary world they returned to seemed to have a quality of unreality about it. Too quiet, too small, too unconcerned with the things that concern a person who's been where they had been. Some of these men drank. Some of them could not stay in one place for very long, moving from town to town and occupation to occupation in a restlessness that was not exactly ambition and not exactly running away, but something in between, the expression of a body that had been moving for 4 years and had not yet fully learned how to stop. Some of them carried physical wounds that did not allow them to do the work they had done before, the arm that had been amputated at a field hospital, the chronic pain of an untreated wound, the deafness that came from years of standing in the proximity of cannon fire, and had to rebuild their livelihoods around these facts with whatever was available to rebuild with, which was not always much. The country they came back to was a different country in some respects, or it was trying to be, or it was in the process of arguing about whether it was, which is not the same thing. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery. 4 million people had been freed. The enormous foundational wrong that had driven the war to its crisis point had been formally resolved, and the question of what resolution actually meant in practice, what freedom meant, what citizenship meant, what the country owed the people who had been held in bondage and the people who had fought and died to end that bondage, was now the question, as large and difficult as the war itself, and just as resistant to quick or easy answers. The men of the United States colored troops came home carrying a particular weight on top of the weight that all veterans carried. They had fought in a war that had freed their people, had fought for something the stakes of which were not abstract to them in any sense, and they returned to a country that was, in the immediate aftermath of the war, making promises about what their freedom and their service would mean, promises whose fulfillment would prove, in the decades to come, dramatically incomplete. Men who had served in uniform, who had stood in battle lines and bled and buried their messmates and marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in the Grand Review, returned to states and towns where they could not vote, where they could not hold certain jobs, where the law did not protect them the ways that the law they had fought to preserve was supposed to protect everyone. The gap between what had been promised and what was delivered was not a small gap, and the men who experienced it knew it was not small, and their letters and their testimonies in the post-war years carry a particular kind of sorrow that is a sorrow of betrayal understood clearly. The white veterans of the Union armies came home to a somewhat different reception, celebrated, in the immediate aftermath, with a warmth that the country's grief and relief had generated and that the politics of the moment sustained. Grand Army of the Republic posts open in towns across the North, gathering places for veterans where the rituals of the war, the hierarchy of rank, the shared vocabulary, the particular humor, and the particular silences could be maintained in some form, where the men who had been through it together could sit in the same room with each other without having to explain anything, which was perhaps the simplest form of relief available to them. These posts were political as well as social. The veteran vote a significant force in the post-war decades, and the memory of the war, what it had meant, what it had been for, who the heroes were, was contested and negotiated through these organizations and through the culture around them for as long as the men who had fought it were alive. The Confederate veterans came home to something different still, to a South that had been physically devastated in ways the North had not been, to economies shattered and landscapes scarred, and a political order that had collapsed under the weight of its own defeat. The men who came back to burn farmhouses and ruin fields and the fundamental reorganization of everything they had understood as the structure of their world had their own form of grief and dislocation to navigate, alongside the guilt and the complexity of having fought for a cause that was now lost and that history was already beginning to judge. The lost cause mythology that gathered around the Confederate memory in the post-war years, the idea of a noble and doomed struggle, of a civilization overcome by superior numbers rather than a wrong overcome by a right, was partly a genuine expression of grief and partly a psychological necessity. The story that people told themselves in order to carry the weight of what they had done and what had been done to them, and it took root with a tenacity that had consequences stretching far beyond the men who first reached for it. Elisha Rhodes went home to Rhode Island. He was 23 years old, and he had a chest full of things he would carry for the rest of his life. And he was also, in the straightforward practical sense, a young man who needed a job. He went back to work. He married. He had children. He joined the Grand Army of the Republic. He kept his diary, though the entries after the war have a different quality from the wartime ones. Less urgent, less packed with event, the handwriting of a man whose days have settled into a different rhythm. He lived until 1917, long enough to see the 20th century begin and to watch the world he had helped to save start building toward another catastrophe he would not live to see end. He was, in most visible respects, a successful and settled man of his time and place, a businessman, a civic figure, a husband and father, a person embedded in the ordinary, ongoing life of his community. And he was also, always, the young man who had marched south in the summer of 1861 with his diary in his pack and a question in his chest about what he was made of, and who had spent 4 years finding out. Both of those things were true simultaneously, as they are true of every person who has been through something that large, the ordinary life continuing alongside the weight of the experience, neither canceling the other, both present, both real. The men of the Civil War, the 3 million who put on uniforms and went, and the hundreds of thousands who did not come back, recede from us now across more than a century and a half, the distance growing with every year that passes, the last of the veterans gone for generations, the war itself becoming history in the formal sense, something to be studied, interpreted, argued over, memorialized in stone and bronze in the words of 1,000 books. The debates about what the war meant and what it was for, and whether it accomplished what it set out to accomplish, are debates that are still alive and still consequential, and that do not appear to be approaching resolution. The country that was saved by the war and chained by it, and in some respects undone by how it ended, is still living inside those questions. But somewhere underneath the arguments, underneath the monuments and the histories and the long national argument about memory and meaning, there's something simpler and more durable. A young man in a tent on a winter morning. The smell of coffee. The weight of a letter in a breast pocket. The sound of fiddle on a cold evening, coming from somewhere in the rows of dark tents, sweet and thin in the Virginia air. The name of the man in the next bunk, set quietly in the dark to see if he is sleeping yet. The specific color of a Virginia dawn, seen from a hillside while the regiment waited for whatever came next. The sky going from black to gray to a particular pale gold of an early morning in a season that was changing. The light arriving without announcement, as light does, finding everything that was already there and making it briefly, freshly visible. Those men lived there in that specific texture, as fully and as humanly as any people who have ever lived anywhere. They were not symbols or statistics or entries in a casualty register, though they became all of these things in their time. They were people who were cold when it was cold and homesick when the letters stopped coming, and frightened when there was something to be frightened of, and grateful, with a depth and a specificity that the word hardly contains. For the coffee in the morning and the man beside them who could be counted on, and the next letter from home, and the particular pleasure of a day when nothing was required of them and the sun was out and the war, for a few hours, felt as far away as it actually was not. They carried all of this, the fear and the friendship, the boredom and the beauty of it, the weight of what they had seen and the stubborn, necessary warmth of what they still held. And they carried it quietly, most of them, the way you carry something you understand is yours to carry, without expecting anyone else to see it or to name it for you. The diary closes. The tent is dark. Outside, in the long rows of canvas and wood smoke and improvised chimneys and swept dirt floors, the army breathes in its sleep. 300,000 men in a temporary city in a field, dreaming whatever soldiers dream. The Virginia night going on around them vast and indifferent and very still. And somewhere in that stillness, the small and particular life of a young man, written in a careful hand in a small book, continuing into the morning. If this story found you somewhere peaceful, consider sharing it with someone who might need a quiet hour. Sleep well,